visit front. And she looked at some of the injuries that were sustained then, and what we're seeing are strikingly similar, almost exact injuries that are being sustained. People are being shot in the eye, having to lose their eyes because of the impact of rubber bullets. And so, unfortunately, at the beginning of the lockdown, when the president had announced that the police would be responsible for enforcing lockdown regulations and that they'd be supported by the military, a great concern was around how the police tend to rely on excessive uses of force. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that overly militaristic, overly criminalizing style in policing, particularly in the context of a public health crisis, was not at all necessary. And we could have definitely taken a different route. Mm-hmm. But of course, many people are sitting with injuries and scars, both physical and psychological, that they may never be able to get over.
Mm-hmm. Thato, when some police officers are armed with chamboks, right, they're claiming that they are following orders from the top. Now, how do we police, well, ignore the irony in that, how do we police this behavior? And who exactly do we hold accountable? Because clearly, and as you have written in your article, the use of chamboks is unlawful under not only the South African Constitution, but also international human rights law. And it is also not included as one of the weapons that can be used by the members of the South African Police Service. So when police go out there with chamboks and they claim that they are following orders from the top, how do we sort of police that particular behavior?
So that was really striking, and I think that was a report that was done by Amabungane very early on. I think in the first couple of days of the lockdown, where they had gone into town into the Johannesburg CBD to see how the lockdown was being enforced, and I think there was a plainclothes police officer allegedly who was jumping out of an unmarked vehicle at random moments, chasing people off the street with a shambok. Mm. And the reason why we say that the shambok is an unlawful weapon, as you've mentioned, is that it violates the Constitution, because according to the Constitution, we're not to be treated or punished in a cruel, inhumane, or degrading way.
Yes.
But in addition to that, it violates South Africa's 2013 law that was adopted to prevent torture. And the shambok serves no lawful policing purpose, because all it does is really just serve the purpose of inflicting significant pain and injury. And so the question, when we see in that article by Amabungane about, a police officer who basically says, I'm following orders from the top, it's important to understand where those orders come from. Who in the police service, who within the police leadership thought that members of the public needed to be disciplined in this kind of a fashion in order to enforce a lockdown. And it's quite concerning, because if that is the kind of logic that is stemming from the top and infiltrates all the way down to our lowest enforcing officers, you can understand why the kinds of abuses that we've seen are just so prevalent.
Mm-hmm. But I'm going to stay a bit longer on this issue of chamboks, right? When you have police officers on the streets, be it during lockdown or any other period, and they're using chambok, which is of course unlawful and illegal according to the South African Constitution as well as international human rights law. And when you approach them and you ask them to justify the use of that, they say, no, we're just following orders from the top. Now, you obviously cannot go to that quote-unquote top, because as they have mentioned, they're receiving orders from the top. So the next resort is you go to IPID. But because of IPID's inefficiency, continuous efficiency, who do we turn to? Right. What is the solution, if any?
So that really strikes at the heart of the problem with policing in South Africa.
Right.
And I should also just add that tomorrow there'll be an event hosted by the Institute for Security Studies, and it looks at this specific issue about how we prevent police brutality. It is a big problem, because IPID is the oversight body. But before we even get to IPID, we should be able to count on the fact that the police service itself is such a thorough and rigorous institution that any reports of misconduct or abuse coming from the institution will be taken seriously enough, investigated efficiently, independently, and expeditiously, prior to having to rely on an external body like IPID. And unfortunately, the reality in this country is that the police accountability framework, that entire bureaucracy, is pretty broken. And, the only, I cannot really say exactly how that is supposed to be fixed. But one thing I have argued is that, institutions that can assist in supporting police accountability be strengthened. But that SAPS itself has to develop like the appropriate internal culture, a culture that is that ascribes to human rights policing, and that is enforced. So that kind of a logic that is really taken very seriously and respected from within the police service, before we have to count on other bodies to ensure that the police, abide by those rules. We should expect that the police on their own have the right kind of mindset to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And that when we turn to IPID, it's for really serious and egregious crimes. But of course, what happens is basically IPID is inundated with complaints. And they're never sufficiently resourced or sufficiently capacitated to fully deal with all of the complaints that they receive. And outside of IPID, the only other measure that's left is that the state gets sued. So the police ministry gets taken to court for them to pay out. And if you check their annual reports, they're paying out millions, hundreds of millions of rands every year because of these kinds of things. So we should be thinking about how that kind of a cost can be mitigated and perhaps be turned into a way of really improving the police service, as opposed to paying out endless sums of money that really has no impact on accountability or improving the police service.
Absolutely. Thato, when the Minister of Police comes on national television and acknowledges that many cases of police brutality had been reported during the nationwide lockdown, but in the same breath, he adds that the police had the right rather in law to defend themselves using quote unquote proportional force. So what do we make of the minister's commitment, if any, to eradicate police brutality, to eradicate excessive use of force, and as you have mentioned, a military style of policing? How can we rely on the minister's commitment, if in any way?
Right. So it is one thing that is important is, every time like a quote by the Minister of Police, or perhaps in the context of the lockdown, the Minister of Defense, those contexts always, that what they're saying always needs to be contextualized. And I think he was speaking in the context of a spate of police killings. And of course, that would have been the standpoint of the Minister of Police. However, when you say that in the same sentence or in the same breath as you're addressing police brutality, you almost sound as though you're justifying police brutality.
Precisely.
And perhaps that you're endorsing the use of lethal force, which is incredibly dangerous. And the requirements for the use of lethal force are very stringent. And he should not be saying something like that, I think, as loosely as he does, just because it's how that is interpreted by the lowest ranking officer is unclear. And in fact, I think if we're going to use evidence, we would say that, they're interpreting that as a kind of license to basically treat people with excessive uses of force. And I mean, the article that you're referring to, that we were speaking about the use of rubber bullets, speaks to the specific issue, is that police officers have a range of weapons, but in the context of public order policing, where they have the rubber bullet at their disposal, we're seeing that they are far too reliant on it, and they're not even using it in line with what is required for the weapon to be used safely. And so what we're arguing for in the article is that perhaps the use of the rubber bullet in South Africa, particularly in public protest situations, be reconsidered. Perhaps we need a much safer weapon, because internationally and locally, the evidence shows that it is an inherently indiscriminate weapon.
Yes, absolutely. Thato, there's so much to discuss, based on your article, but we are running out of time. So I'm going to put forward a final question to you. The Minister of Police released the SAPS amendment bill for public comment last month. Now, the bill's primary purpose appears to be structural and organizational reforms within and between the police services, be it at national, provincial, as well as municipal levels, including affecting public order policing, as you have written in your article. Do you think this amendment to the bill would regulate police brutality any better?
So the hope is that the civilian secretariat for police gets a strong enough bill that can then be tabled before Parliament. And I think at the stage that the stage that it's currently at is that it's getting comments from the public. So I think members of civil society are definitely using this opportunity to perhaps add in or raise concerns around those specific issues. And I think from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute's perspective, we're most concerned about how policing of protest takes place. And we're also especially concerned about the use of force.
Right.
So that is something that civil society organizations are thinking about and working on, so that the draft that does hopefully get put before Parliament is a strong enough draft that can then be improved further. Some of our biggest concerns, I think, are to establish a meaningful and useful way of accounting for the use of force.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, there seems to be a complete absence of that, where police can use force but never fully really account for it. And Marikana was like a grave example of that, where the police, when they were brought before the Parliament Commission, it seemed that they never expected to ever account for any of the measures and decisions that they had taken.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, in Marikana, that cost lives. It cost 34 minors' lives. And that's something that we need to mitigate against. It's something that we need to ensure that the police are not doing again. And so they are drawing on what happened at Marikana, as well as various other developments that have happened since then. We must remember Marikana was 8 years ago, and so it's been a long time coming that we have some kind of an amendment to the SAPS bill.
Certainly. Thato, we have run out of time, but thank you so very much for your time and insight this morning. I must say I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Thato Masiangoako, a researcher at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, discussing some key questions surrounding policing in South Africa and the often misuse of weapons, excessive force, police brutality, and as Thato mentioned, military style of policing.
After all these years, millions of Syrian refugees and displaced persons are still struggling to get adequate food and nutrition. Since